Attacking millions of Americans because they're Muslims? It's disgusting!
Interpreted and spun deliberately to look like it's inciting violence by those who want to propagate violence. In other words, they twist the meaning.
I was surrounded by really fantastic, strong, feminist Muslim girls. Some of the most devout Muslims that I've met.
Hello, I'm Islamic Comedy Central, and the topic under discussion is, can Muslims peacefully coexist within the West? Now, the reason why I'm visiting this topic is because I hear proto-Marxists spewing these points like Hassan Piker and Piers Morgan, but I also see people more on the center left who are saying these talking points as well. Take, for example, Konstantin Kisin, who on his podcast Trigonometry said this.
One thing that I have some hope for, but I want to run it by you and get your perspective, is we do see in some Middle Eastern countries like the UAE, like Saudi Arabia, also in Central Asia, like I mentioned, I was in Uzbekistan, they don't tolerate you might not agree about the terminology, but they do not tolerate violent jihadis.
So this begs a question. Can Muslims integrate within the West? Can they coexist with other peoples? Can a believing Muslim do that? Now, something that should be stated is that I do not differentiate between extremist and moderate Muslim. You either believe in the Hadiths and the Quran and you follow them, or you do not. And without further ado, here are the three criteria which I think should lead to a reasonable conclusion. 1. Muslim nations have different founding documents than Western nations. 2. Muslims bring a statistical disadvantage to Western societies. And 3, the Quran and the Hadiths command Muslims to not integrate into the West. The reason why it is important to look at the difference between Muslim nations and Western nations is because you can see the differences of what they think believes a nation should be made of. What are the ideals which should make up a nation? And therefore, if one nation disagrees with another nation, it is very hard for them to integrate if their core ideals are not the same, or at least similar in any way. So first up for the West, we got Britain, France, and the United States of America. So first up for the UK, we have the Magna Carta, written in 1215, and it states that it wishes that the English Church shall be free, and that all free men of our kingdom shall be granted liberties and freedoms. For France, we have the Declaration of the Rights of Man, written in 1789, and it states that it wishes to give freedom to its citizens and fellow man. And for the United States of America, we have the Preamble to the Constitution, written in 1776, and it says that it wishes to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So as we can see from these Western nations' founding documents, that the underlying factors are freedom and liberty. And while those weren't always followed up, those were kind of always the factors that were looked upon as good and moral decisions. So for the Islamic nation, we're going to look at Saudi Arabia and see what its founding documents have to say about its founding. So as we can see in Article 1, it says that God's book, aka the Quran, and the Sunnah of his Prophet, God's prayers, and peace be upon him, are its constitution. So we see that the constitution is the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad. Then we see in Articles 6 through 8, it says that the government gets its power from the Quran. And then in Articles 33 and 34, it says that the defense of the Islamic religion is not only the duty of the state, but also for the duty of the citizens, country, and society. And we see from Articles 39 and 40 that communication and just speech in general is restricted by the government to ensure that it is whatever it wants it to say. So as we can see from the Constitution of Saudi Arabia, that it is completely different from those of the West. In fact, it is so different that it completely contradicts all the points that the West gives. And of course, the point I'm trying to get across is, how can someone come from a nation which believes that communication should be restricted and that the state should be up for Allah, and then come into a Western nation and which is the belief of everyone should have free rights? How can they immigrate into that society? Not only do the founding documents show that there is a huge difference between the freedoms of the Western nations and Islamic nations, but we can also look at freedom maps between the Middle East and the West, and we can see how different they are. For example, here's the map for the Middle East. As you can see, it's all purple, meaning that there is almost no freedoms. And now we can look at the freedom map for the West, and as we can see, most of it is green, meaning that there is almost complete freedom. There is only a couple of spots that are yellow, but most of it is green, which means that most of it is almost completely free. The second reason why I think that Muslims cannot coexist in the West is because they bring a negative statistical outcome whenever they immigrate to the West. To show this, we're going to look at 3 different countries. We're going to look at the UK, Spain, and France. The reason why I chose these 3 countries is because they have allowed enough Muslim migration to show a topical importance. And not only that, but their statistics are easily available online, and I don't have to really dig through a lot in order to find meaningful statistics. First off, we'll start with the UK. So as we can see from the immigration statistics from the UK, we can see in 2019 that the immigration statistics were somewhat normal. Then they took a dip in early 2021 and then began to rise later in 2021, peaking in 2023. As we can see from immigration stats, that there are just as many British nationals leaving Britain than there are non-EU nationals. This should be noted because whenever looking at these statistics, we should look at the immigration statistic and not the net migration, because that is the amount of non-EU nationals that are entering the country rather than just net migration in general. Then we can look at the assault crime statistics for the UK, and we can see that there was a buildup of assault crimes up until early 2021, where there was a dip in all the statistics, and then a significant rise, especially in robbery. Now, some might say that there is no way to link this to Muslim migrants. However, if we look at the statistics for nationalities immigrating to the UK, we can see that in early 2021, there was a large dip in non-Muslim countries with a non-Muslim majority. And then we can see that there was a significant rise in countries where they had a significant Muslim population, that being India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Bangladesh. We can see that in these same time periods, there was a 70% increase in sexual assaults between the ages of 16 and 59. As we can see by this chart, the top 10 nationalities most likely to be charged with sexual offense are all from Muslim nationalities. For example, Afghanistan, Eritrea, Egypt, Moroccan, the top 10 are all Muslim nations. Just to put some disparity into perspective, per 1 British person that is charged with sexual offense, there would be more than 12 Afghani nationals that would be charged with sexual offense. This is a huge disparity, which is not just some minor, tit-for-tat statistic. This is a huge disparity. So while I am bringing this information, there are many people who would disagree with what I am saying, and so I would just like to address those points and why I do not think that this is an accurate representation of what is actually going on. First off, there are many people who say that there is a decrease in crime within the UK. However, this is the biggest gaslighting I think I might have ever seen in my life. This is completely and utterly not true. While there has been a decrease in minor crimes like pickpocketing, stealing, and whatnot, there has been a significant increase in especially violent and more sexual crimes. Not only that, but we can see why there is less petty crime reported. For example, there have been many political activists and police officers that have come out saying that the police won't report petty crime anymore, or if you report it to the police, they won't do anything about it, and multiple people have brought this up. If you would like to see the examples that are given, Trigonometry has brought on multiple people to really explain this issue deeply, and I will give multiple links to that within the description. The second part of this is that migrants, or Muslim migrants specifically, are not responsible for these more sexual or violent crimes. However, this is just not true. We can look at these statistics that they give, and a lot of them aren't accurate to specifically Muslim migrants. Also, the number of sexual crimes committed by Muslims is still high, despite there being evidence that reporting on this has been very scarce at all. Take, for example, in the Rotherham report, which found that not only were the police not reporting the sexual crimes of Pakistani Muslims, but they were actually in on the activities themselves. This shows that while the numbers might seem quite high for Muslim sexual crimes, it is probably even higher as there has been scarce reporting on it, and the police have been in on with these gangsters to cover up the evidence for this. And then for the next one, we have Spain, which the statistics seem to show the same picture, but let's just take a look at them real quick. So first off, we have the net migrations. We can see that there was a slight rise from 2016 to 2019. Then we can see a dip in 2020. Then we can see a violent rise in 2022 and 2023. We can now see the crime statistics for Spain, and we can see that in the blue, there's a slight rise over time from 2016 to 2019. Then there is a significant drop in 2020, then a violent rise in 2022 and 2023. And then we can look in the year 2022, where there is a violent rise in crime and immigration. We can see that Moroccans were one of the most imported nationalities in Spain. Now, what some people might note is that Morocco isn't that big comparative to the immigrant population. However, if we look at the people who are immigrating away from Spain, we can see that in comparison to Morocco, there are much more non-Islamic nations that are immigrating away from Spain. Again, we can look at the population of immigrants in Spain, and we can see that Morocco is the main population in Spain, being 900,000. And then finally, let's look at France. First off, we can see that the migration in France has gradually risen over time while fluctuating a bit during 2016 through 2023. However, it has been on the rise mainly. And then we can look at a summary of sexual assault in France in 2024. And we can see there at the bottom that there has been a 7% increase over time from 2016 to 2023 of sexual assault increasing. And then again, who is doing these crimes? Is it Chin Shi who is going about his business and people are running away from him because they are afraid that they are going to get chased after? Huh? Is it the Chinese guy who's walking across the street and everyone's afraid of him? No, of course it's not. It's always the guy whose name is Muhammad. We can look at these statistics from what are the nationalities of the immigrants in France. We can see that the top three are Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. Now, I don't know if you know this, but all of those places are Muslim majority and have an Islamic government. Now, if we look back to that summary of sexual assault, we can see that actually in 2024, there was a decrease in sexual assault. However, we can actually know the reason why. Early in 2024, we can see that there was an immigrant law passed restricting some of the immigration into France, meaning that people couldn't get in as easily, and there would have been less immigration into France. And in the meantime, looking over all these stats, you can find a plethora of journalists and newspapers saying the exact opposite of what you would find during research. Also, just recently, in December of 2025, a person by the name of Nick Shirley did a documentary and showing how there was billions of dollars of fraud going on in Minnesota by the Somali community, showing out that there were fake daycare centers which the government was giving the Somali community in order to provide daycare for children, which they were not doing whatsoever. Also, while doing research for this, I found an interesting stat by Bild, which is a reputable German newspaper, which stated that there was a far higher rate of Afghans and Syrians committing crimes than German residents. In fact, the disproportion was so high that it was 10 times more likely for a Syrian or Afghan to commit a violent crime than it was a German. That would mean that per singular German that you would find committing a crime, you would find 10 Afghans or 10 Syrians committing violent crimes. So again, these were 3 countries which all of these statistics, or at least a majority of them, were from their own government, and show that there was, in the time that there was a rise in Muslim immigration, there was a rise in sexual violence and physical violence and just violence in general. You can find multiple newspapers out there that will say that there are no negative consequences to immigration. However, as we have seen, the statistics show the opposite of that. These people seem to have the mental capacity and the survival instincts of a sea pickle. They're the people who will not shoot themselves in the foot, but will shoot you in the foot, and then will write blogs and articles asking why you think they shot you in the foot. Speaking of the mental capacity of a sea pickle, let's look at the bit of wisdom Piers Morgan had to give us at the beginning of this video.
That's the inevitability of a growing Muslim population is they'll want to take over the country. Muslim culture over all others have their own legal system, their own rules, everything else. And I just don't see that. But the vast majority do not seem to want that. There are people who say that the Quran, for example, it gets interpreted and spun deliberately to look like it's inciting violence by those who want to propagate violence. In other words, they twist the meaning of the text to suit their violent intent. And the Bible, I'm a Christian, the Bible's full of violence, obviously. But the Quran, comparative to the Bible, is nowhere near as violent.
It sounds like Piers Morgan graduated from the Somali-owned Leering Center, but I guess that's besides the point. If we use our eyes and look at these statistics, we'll see that almost half of all Muslims in the UK say that they would support the introduction of Sharia law, and only 22% would be opposed. 44% of Muslims supported the idea that schools should be able to insist on the hijab or the niqab, and again, only 53% would want to quote-unquote fully integrate. And 53% said they preferred to send their children to schools with strong Muslim values. And to top off the cake, only 4% of all Muslims in the UK say that 9/11 was done by the group who claimed to have done the act. Almost 8 times as many claim that the American government did it, and almost double say that the Jews did it. This thoroughly shows how 96% of the Muslim population in the UK has the reasoning capability of a toddler and is therefore utterly brainwashed. There was even one participant who said there was no Jews that were in that day, meaning in the Twin Towers. I mean, what can I say? I'm convinced. With the use of his words, it sounds like Piers Morgan would say a vast majority of the population is female, but at the same time, a vast majority of the population is also male. Let's take Piers' criticism to heart, and let's actually read the Quran and see what it says rather than looking at what everyone else says. In chapter 3, verse 141, it says, "In that Allah may purify the believers through trials and destroy the disbelievers." We see in chapter 98, verse 6 of the Quran, that it says, "Indeed, they who have disbelieved among the people of the scripture and the polytheists will be in the fire of hell, abiding eternally therein. Those are the worst of creatures." We have Surah 3, verse 118, which says, "O you who have believed, do not take as intimates those other than yourselves, for they will not spare you any ruin. They wish you would have hardship. Hatred has already appeared from their mouths, and what their breasts conceal is greater. We have certainly made clear to you the signs, if you will use reason." In chapter 8, verse 12, it says, "When your Lord inspired to the angels, I am with you, so strengthen those who have believed. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who have disbelieved. So strike them upon the necks and strike from them every fingertip." And then in the next verse it says, "To do this to those who oppose Allah and his messenger." In chapter 5, verse 51, it says, "O you who have believed, do not take the Jews and the Christians as allies. They are in fact allies of one another, and whoever is an ally to them among you, then indeed he is one of them. Indeed, Allah does not guide the wrongdoing people." In chapter 5, verse 33 of the Quran, it says, "Indeed, the penalty for those who wage war against Allah and his messenger and strive upon the earth to cause corruption is none but that they be killed or crucified, or that their hands and feet be cut off from opposite sides, or that they be exiled from the land. That is for them a disgrace in this world, and for them is in the hereafter is a great punishment." And then finally we have chapter 9, verse 8, which says, "How can there be a treaty, while if they gain dominance over you, they do not observe concerning you any pact of kinship or covenant of protection? They satisfy you with their mouths, but their hearts refuse compliance, and most of them are defiantly disobedient." Ultimately, this last verse will lead me into my conclusion why I think Muslims cannot coexist within the West, and it is precisely because of chapter 9, verse 8. The verse is saying that you can't just give lip service to the Muslims. You can't just say all of this. You actually have to let them do what they do with impunity. And not only that, but you also have to comply with what they do. So, and if you do not, then you are a disbeliever, and they have every authority to do whatever they want with you. This interpretation is not far-fetched at all. In fact, this is also confirmed by Ibn Kathir. As Ibn Kathir says in his Tafsir, Allah encourages the believers to show enmity to the idolaters and to disassociate from them, affirming that they do not deserve to enjoy a covenant of peace because of their shirk, otherwise known as disbelief in Allah and disbelief in Allah's messenger. If these disbelievers have a chance to defeat Muslims, they will cause great mischief, leave nothing unharmed, disregard the ties of kinship and the sanctity of their vows. Ibn Abbas said, "Ill, otherwise known as religious trials or hardships, means kinship, while dhimma, think of like Jim Crow laws but worse. It's like a second-class citizen, means covenant." So if we look back at that verse, chapter 9, verse 8, and we replace those words with what Ibn Kathir, one of the most celebrated Islamic scholars, says it is correlated with, we can replace covenant with dhimmism, or second-class citizen, like worse than Jim Crow law, and then kinship with religious trials. And we can see that this is talking about lowering people down to a point where they can't do anything about Muslims, and they basically cannot practice their own religion. So while Western ideas are freedom, liberty, and democracy, as shown as the founding documents, the Magna Carta, the preamble to the Constitution, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, Islam actually requires you to create this second-class citizenship for anybody who is not a Muslim. That is why Muslims cannot coexist within the West, because they don't have our ideals. They actually require us to become second-class citizens. That is the whole point of Islam, is that Muslims will rule over the non-believer.